Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give folks just a couple more minutes before we get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. I still see we have people hopping on, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Susan Lambert. I'm with Amplify. I'll talk a little bit more about myself, but first I want to talk a bit about Amplify and why we're doing the Science of Reading webinar today. Here at Amplify, we've really been working on the science of reading for almost 2 decades, and it started in the world of assessment, and we've now moved into the world of digital, and we've moved into the world of curriculum. We'll talk more about who we are potentially at another webinar series. Today, we're really here to talk about the science of reading and why now, why this topic is so important. We know that it's got into the popular media. People are talking about the science of reading, and we really wanted to take this time to talk about what does that mean and what do we believe here at Amplify. So thanks for joining us. Let's get this moving forward. Here we go. So housekeeping. Before we get going, just so that you know, this webinar is being recorded. And for those of you that have registered for the webinar, we will be emailing you the recording. For those of you that may have to jump off early, for those of you, I guess if you weren't able to join, you won't be hearing this. But again, if you registered for the webinar, you'll get that recording. If you are having technical difficulties, a couple of things you can do. There is the questions panel that you can put questions in there. We have somebody sitting behind the scenes here answering those questions. You may also need to just restart the Zoom application. And the questions panel. We will be answering questions at the end of today's webinar, so please put them in that questions panel so that we can get to Q&A at the end. So again, my name is Susan Lambert, and when I'm not doing what I'm doing at work, I'm doing things like playing out in the wilderness. And so one of the things about me is I've explored all over the world, and we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of background knowledge as we talk about the simple view of reading. But my background knowledge is visiting places all over the world and loving to add to that to my experiences. But I also want you to know that I sort of grew up in this world of education. So I came into education as a classroom teacher. I understand what it means for the complexities of the day-to-day of the teacher. I've also been a building administrator. I've been in a district office as a director of curriculum and assessment. And now I come to you as the early literacy instruction person here at Amplify that looks across all of our products to ensure that we are paying attention to what the science of reading says. And I'm really excited that we're going to introduce you to that today. I want to talk a little bit about my why. I said I came into education as a classroom teacher, and I did. And the reason that I did, it was a second career for me. I knew I wanted to be in the classroom and not stay in the classroom. And this is a picture of my why, or what motivated me to come into this world of early literacy, or into this world of elementary education. This is Michael. He's my second son, and he's holding my lovely granddaughters. That youngest one just turned a year old. So fun to watch them grow and develop. Michael really struggled in the early grades learning to read. Such a good kid in class, always well behaved, never got in trouble. And I was really concerned about his progress in reading, and remember going to the kindergarten teacher saying, "What can I do at home to help?" And the response was, "He's a great kid. It's going to catch up. He's going to be fine." And then I went to the first grade teacher, said the same thing. "What can I do at home to help? I'm really concerned about his lack of progress." She said the same thing. "It's developmental. He's doing all that he needs to be doing. He's going to catch up. He's going to be just fine." By the time we got to fourth grade, he wasn't fine. I knew there was an issue, and it was a challenge to get him to school every single day. Why? Not because he didn't want to learn, or not because he couldn't learn, but because it was very apparent that he could not participate in reading exercises, read in front of the class, because he had a deficiency. And it was dyslexia. And so that's what pulled me into this world, to start to understand what is it that kids need to have to be able to learn how to read. And the more and more I have dug into the research, the more I understand that we have known for a really long time what it takes to be a proficient reader, and classrooms across the United States just aren't doing that for various reasons. So that was a pretty heavy introduction, but what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take a poll to find out who you are. So who is joining us today? You should see a poll on your screen, and I'd like to let you, or have you let us know, are you a district level administrator? Are you a school level administrator? Do you work as an instructional coach? Are you an intervention or special ed teacher? Maybe you're a classroom teacher, maybe you're Susan's mom, or maybe you're just one of those other things. So make sure you take time to answer that poll so we can get to know who's out there in our audience today. And let's see what we found. Look at there, 2% of you out there are actually Susan's mom. That's really cool. Looks like 42% of you work in the other field, but a good smattering of people. It's really interesting to me, if I could talk to you as a group, to find out what it was that motivated you to actually join this webinar today. What do you have in terms of background knowledge of the science of reading, and what you hope to accomplish? Please make sure that you post any questions that you may have, or any comments that you may have in that question box. So one thing I do know is that any teacher or any educator that is in the world of elementary education now has a passion for teaching kids to become readers. We want kids to be able to experience this love and joy, or the magic of what happens when you get engrossed in a book, to take you away from all of the perils of this world. And so I know all of us share that. The thing that we want to dig into then is to really understand what it takes. What's the science of what it takes for students to learn how to read? So 4 goals today. We're going to dig into the science of reading, or the simple view of reading. We're going to look at what that means in a comprehensive literacy program. We're also going to talk about some principles of the science of reading, and I'm going to leave you with some next steps for how you can take your learning to the next level. So let's start with the science of reading. So I'm going to read this aloud to you, and while I'm reading it aloud, feel free to read along if you want to, but the purpose of this read is so that you can identify a title for this paragraph. This way can be a lot trickier than the ordinary method, because you will know next to nothing beforehand. Make a plan you're comfortable with, keeping in mind that familiar environments often work best. It's important to critically evaluate any descriptions you hear. think about the intentions of the person presenting the idea before deciding to take the risk. It's hard to back out once things start. The initial moment has a great impact on what follows, with physical events playing a prominent role. If all your expectations are fulfilled, repeat the process. Be careful who you talk to, or all the details could become public knowledge. All right, so what I'd like you to do is let's take a little quiz. So if you were going to title that paragraph, give us a sense of what you believe the title of this paragraph should be. Planning a surprise party? Deciding on an investment plan? Learning how to swim? Or maybe there's something other that you have in mind. Go ahead and take some time to do that. We'll give you about, 5 more seconds. This is a common exercise we ask students to do in the classroom, right? Basically, what we're trying to do is find the main idea of that passage, summarize that information, give it a really good title. So we have actually planning a surprise party as the winner in this particular poll. So let's just see what the topic actually is. Advice for a blind date. So if we were to go back and reread that paragraph, now that we have the title, or what I call the context for the paragraph, we make much better connections knowing that this is about advice for a blind date. So this hits at one of the topics, and I guess maybe more the essence of the simple view of reading. I would venture to guess that all of you were able to recognize all the words in that passage, whether I would have read it aloud or had you read it to yourself. What was missing for you was context, because not only were you able to decode those words or recognize those words, in isolation, you probably know what each of those individual words mean, but when you put it together, lacking a context, you were struggling to make some kind of association with that. And so this is the essence then of what we talk about the simple view of reading. So what is the simple view of reading? Where did it come from? And why is it so important as we talk about what students need to have in instruction and what we need to do in terms of intervention for struggling readers? So let's put this on a timeline. You can see this is about 1986. For those of you that have been around the world of education or been in elementary education, you know that this was really the peak of the reading wars. What do I mean by reading wars? Well, do we teach kids from a whole language approach, which basically means just put kids in a room, surround them with books, like get them exposure to high quality literature, and it's going to be a natural process. They will learn how to read just by having that exposure and the experience. The other hand was, no, we really need to teach kids phonics, right? We can't just surround kids with books. We need to teach them sound spelling patterns and what it means. So the researchers then said, hey, let's see if we can figure out how to clarify then the role of decoding as it comes to reading proficiencies. At that time, and I would say that even now, many educators believe that strong decoding skills actually aren't necessary for strong reading proficiency, that beginning and struggling readers should just be taught to compensate for their weak decoding by guessing an unfamiliar word based on the first letter or the picture, or asking themselves if a word might make sense in a sentence. In contrast to that, decoding, when decoding is the focus of instruction, students are taught to sound them out. So this study sought recognition and language comprehension. So just a couple of slides to talk about the study and the results of the study. They took 4 to 5 years to look at this. These were in kids including grades K through 4. They actually were able to assess discrete parts of this sort of formula. Word recognition, they were able to assess with nonsense words. Language comprehension, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. They were able to assess with a read aloud and then asking questions after the read aloud. And then reading proficiency, they were able to assess after the students actually read a passage. So what did they find out? What were the results of this? Remember, they were looking for the correlation of basically this formula for what they were doing. And what they found out was, you know what, there's actually a high correlation in grade 1, in grade 2, and in grades 3 and 4, meaning that this formula that they were seeking to try to validate actually was valid, and the results of the study have been replicated, and they've also been supported in most recent years with MRI, so actually looking at the way that the brain works and how the brain responds. So that's really cool, but let's talk about some details then of what this means. So let's look at this formula again. So basically this says that you need to have two things to become a proficient reader. You need to have language comprehension, and you need to have word recognition. Language comprehension is all about the words that you know in the oral environment and how you're able to utilize them both in your speaking and in your listening context. And word recognition is all about, can you lift the words off of the page? Can you first decode them, and then can you work towards understanding them? And these two elements are critical to become proficient readers. The simple view of reading formula here really makes it clear that strong reading comprehension cannot occur unless we have both of them. Let's talk math for just a minute. So if we were to use a 0 and a 1, and let's say on a scale from 0 to 1, 0 means nothing, 1 means you can do it all. If you had 0 in language comprehension and a 1 in word recognition, basically you could lift the words off of the page, but you didn't understand what they meant. You actually have no reading proficiency. If you flipped it around the other way, it's the same thing. If you have all language comprehension, you understand words. If somebody read you aloud a paragraph or passage, you could understand what that meant, but you couldn't lift the words off of the page, again, you wouldn't have any reading proficiency. So this is not additive. This is actually a multiplication problem, a multiplication issue, meaning that you have to have both. So another way to say it is that we can't teach kids more and more and more decoding to make up for a lack of language comprehension, just like we can't give you more and more language comprehension to make up for a lack of decoding. It just doesn't work that way. You have to have both. So what do these things mean? Language comprehension, again, that's all about the ability to understand oral language. It's all about background knowledge and vocabulary. And if you think about this, language comprehension begins from the day that you're born. Some would contend from before you're born. So when kids are born, they start to hear conversations. When they get to be, like my granddaughter, about a year old, they start to mock or mimic words, and they start to use things, right, in that oral environment or that speaking and listening environment. Critical time that they're developing a sense of knowledge, they're developing vocabulary, but all of this is in the oral language environment before we actually get to reading. I want you to do this for me, and I want you to listen to a passage. Again, let's do this a little like the exercise we did before. Think of the title for this passage. I want you to think about what you think the topic of this passage is, and just listen. The question of space-time singularities is morally equivalent to that of high-energy scattering. Both probe the ultraviolet nature of gravity. A space-time geometry is made of a coherent collection of gravitons, just as the electric and magnetic fields in a laser are made from a collection of photons. The short distance structure of space-time is governed, after Fourier transform, by high momentum gravitons. Understanding space-time singularities and high energy scattering are different sides of the same coin. We are not going to take a quiz on what the context of that passage might have been. For those of you that are Big Bang Theory watchers, that was all about string theory. We're going to come back to that passage in a minute. You probably were able to understand some of the words in the sentences there, but by putting them all together, you didn't have the context because you probably don't have background knowledge in string theory. And I'm making an assumption, maybe some of you do. So that's sort of the language comprehension. Again, hold that. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. Let's talk about word recognition, the ability to recognize written words correctly. And as you're looking at my screen right now, I'm going to venture to say that none of you are having to decode or chunk up or sound out the words on the screen. That's because you have practiced and seen these words over and over and over again. And that's the ultimate goal of actually teaching decoding or teaching word recognition, is we want to make sure that students understand that the sounds that they hear, right, those things that they come to school already knowing, which is sounds and words, that they're actually represented by letters or combinations of letters, and those combinations of letters make up words, and we want them to practice at that very, very small phoneme or sound letter and build from there so that they can then practice, get repetition, and instantly recognize words. So the goal of actually word recognition or phonics instruction is so that you never have to use that again, so that you can become so fluent that you can use all of your cognitive energy to actually think about the topic of the passage. So let's look at this again. This is the passage that I just read to you. And if you look at those words on the screen, again, the same idea. When you look at those, you probably recognize most all of them. Let's highlight a few that maybe you had to bring some word attack skills to, maybe you had to try to sound out, but for the most part, you probably can recognize all of those words. So if you had known the context of string theory, you would have been able to say what the main idea of this passage is. Not going to kind of get into all of the comprehension implications about knowledge at this point, but just again, a reminder that we actually need two things to be proficient readers. We need to understand how to decode the words on a page, and we need sufficient background knowledge to be able to understand the context and then make connections with what we're reading. So again, reading ability can only result from a combination of these two things. Now, classroom teachers, you're probably thinking right now, what does my reading instruction look like, and am I accounting for both of these things in the classroom? Fortunately for you, we're going to be following up this webinar with a series of other webinars that will help us dive deeper into both sides of the simple view of reading. And again, when we get to the end of the webinar, we'll give you some information of places that you can go to really deepen your knowledge about what this looks like, both at the classroom level and across the literacy program. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about then, what does this look like as we are attempting to put in place a comprehensive literacy program. And by comprehensive literacy program, I mean, what is happening at the school level or at the district level as it relates to all of the things we need to put in place. So let's start first with another visual of the simple view of reading, which is known as Scarborough's rope or Scarborough's braid. Many of you are probably familiar with this. If we sort of break this down in terms of the visualization, you'll see the two elements of the simple view of reading. You see the language comprehension on top in sort of the blue-purple strands, and you see the word recognition on the bottom in the green strands. And you'll see that there's some discrete things that need to happen in each of these, with the idea that as students become increasingly strategic in their approach to text and increasingly automatic in their approach to text, these things get woven together to build reading proficiency. I've heard somebody say something about the curse of knowledge, meaning that once you know or are a proficient reader, you don't often think or backtrack in terms of what the ingredients are that you had to build that reading proficiency. Sort of like when you eat a chocolate chip cookie, right? You can't often see all of the things involved in that recipe to get you to the really yummy place of eating that cookie. And that's what we want to get kids to, is the really yummy place of being able to enjoy reading. So language comprehension is all about knowledge, vocabulary, how to put those into sentences and make connections and get some kind of understanding around the topic of discussion or what we're reading. And again, word recognition, the idea of sounds, letters, and words. What I love about this visual is it was actually created by a woman named Scarborough. And the goal here was to really uncover or make a representation that parents could understand what is happening when kids are learning to read. And so this was put together for that purpose, to really then dig into the recipe, if you will, of what it takes to become a proficient reader. When we talk about what it takes to have a comprehensive literacy program with sort of the simple view of reading in mind, let's just talk about the the elements that go into that comprehensive reading program and how we can sort of overlay the simple view of reading with that. So stepping outside of the simple view of reading for just a minute, a really comprehensive literacy program needs to have really strong core instruction. What this means is that when a kid comes to school in kindergarten and in first grade and in second grade, we need to understand what it is they need to know and be able to do, and package that in a way that helps prevent later need for intervention. They need quality core instruction. We need to teach them what they need to know to become proficient readers. So with a simple view of reading, your core instruction should be paying attention to both language comprehension, and it should be paying attention to decoding. When we get to differentiated instruction and practice, which we always have to do, right? There's always a need for either the over-the-shoulder, I need the student right here and right now in a very simple way, all the way to this group of kids needs some extra instruction and extra time and extra practice. That differentiated instruction and extra practice along the entire continuum needs to align to and support that core instruction. So we shouldn't be pulling in random ideas, random activities that distract kids from what they need to be learning in the core instruction, but it needs to be in alignment. And the same with intervention. We may need to take a group of kids and give them even more strategic time in intervention, time and attention, smaller grouping, more one-on-one, an instruction in a different way, but we should still be focusing on what's needed to become proficient or the science of reading elements. Then you notice this thing called data that's going all the way through all of these elements. And the thing about data is that it needs to tie it all up together. So your data should never be random or disconnected from what you're attempting to do in your literacy program. And so the assessments that you select or the data you choose to gather should be supporting, number one, what do kids need to become proficient readers, and how is that being implemented in core instruction, in your differentiated instruction, and throughout your intervention. And so again, we will be following up with more information about how you can select the appropriate tools to ensure that what you have in terms of comprehensive literacy program in your schools and in your districts actually supports and informs then this idea of both language comprehension and word recognition. So let's stop for just a second and think about why this makes a difference. So one of the things that we also know is this fourth grade reading proficiency has been pretty much all over the news and pretty much hasn't changed for the last several decades. So I'd like you to take some time and think about this question. How many students across the United States in fourth grade are actually considered proficient readers? So go ahead and make your selection there. This is, again, those students that are at or above the level of proficiency. We'll give you about 3, 2, 1, and let's see how we did. You know the data, so it is absolutely correct that 36% of our fourth graders across the nation are reading proficiently. And that's a pretty poor performance, if you will, for the United States. And we can change that. We can change that in terms of what's happening in our classrooms and what's happening at the school level. Again, we know what it takes to get kids to learn how to read. We just have to make sure that we're paying attention to that and actually implementing that across all of our classrooms. So with that then, what would we say is some really great principles that we can look at for implementation and what it means for the science of reading across schools and across districts? So let's start with number one. Number one is reading is not natural. It can and it must be taught. I think this is probably the hardest thing to sort of the hardest myth to break through in terms of our implementations across the country, because there was a really long time, remember back to the reading wars and when we talked about whole language, that people assumed that reading is just a natural process, that we don't need to be explicit about it, that kids are just going to get it on their own, and this is absolutely not true. It can be taught, it should be taught, and it should start in the earliest of grades in kindergarten when kids come to us as early learners. Along with that, again, the second element of that simple view of reading, background knowledge is as critical to comprehension as decoding skills are. You've experienced that twice in today's webinar. You could understand the individual words, you could probably decode all the words that were on the page of that paragraph, but I'm guessing the majority of us were not able to put that into context. If you can't put words into context to gain meaning, then you're not gaining meaning, and that's really the ultimate goal of reading. And so we have to bring to our students background knowledge early and often. So number three, foundational skills instructions must be systematic and explicit, and it has to begin with sounds. Sounds are the smallest, the phonemes, the smallest part of our English language, and we have to start there and build up. Let's talk a little bit about what it means to be systematic and explicit. Basically, explicit is you just need to tell the kids what they need to learn so they can learn it, right? We want them to become fluent with it. We don't want to make this a mystery or something that they have to figure out on their own. Let's just teach it to them and let them practice and learn it so that we can focus on the context of a passage and building background knowledge. What does it mean to be systematic? And I think this is one of those things that is often misunderstood. The idea of being systematic means that, well, one, you have a scope and sequence in place. You know what kids should learn in kindergarten. You know what kids should learn in first grade. And the teacher's actually teaching to that. So I'll never forget when I was a building principal for the first time, and I thought, you know, it's going to be a really great idea if I do some observations and just sort of walk around and see what's happening in the classroom. The school that I was in was struggling with proficiency both in reading and in math, and so I decided to make English language arts my first focus. And so what I did was I went to the English language arts block during the day, which a good K-2 school will have that all at the same time. This school did the same thing, and I walked into a kindergarten classroom and saw some instruction. Walked into the second kindergarten classroom, saw some instruction, but interestingly, it was different than what was in that first kindergarten classroom. The third kindergarten classroom was teaching something a little bit different, and the pattern went on and on and on all the way through the grades. The idea here is that there was no systematic approach. Those teachers could have been quality teachers delivering high quality instruction, but if every kid is learning something different, number one, that's not a matter of equity, and number two, that means that when all of those kindergarten kids moved into first grade, the first grade teacher is starting out with gaps that were created by the instruction in the classroom because it wasn't systematic. So we need to pay attention to ensuring that we are not introducing more gaps in our students' learning by ensuring that across our school system, all kindergarten kids are getting the same kind of instruction. And it's not just instruction that is rote and boring, we must make it engaging. So this is the idea of multisensory instruction, particularly in the decoding. Instruction can be dry and boring, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can infuse multiple modalities and multiple senses to ensure that students are actually putting this information into their brain in an efficient way. We also know that science-based reading instruction reduces the need for intervention. We talked about this before, right? This is, for those of you that are educators, the RTI model, or the response to intervention, which was introduced into the world of education based on the healthcare industry. There's a reason you go to the doctor and you get weighed and have your blood pressure taken and all of the blood work done, so that the doctor can look for symptoms of diseases and be sure that they can intervene early. The same idea here is that if we give students the instruction that they need to have to become proficient readers in the early grades, that good, strong core instruction, we won't need to intervene as often as we did in the past. There's actually some research out there to say that it's actually a cost-effective measure. If you invest in prevention, it's actually much cheaper than having to intervene in students later on. And science-based reading instruction then is a matter of equity. You know, every kindergarten kid that walks through the door on the first day of school deserves to have the kind of instruction that will help them become proficient readers. Yes, will we need to help them build background knowledge? We can do that. But we know that all kids can learn and need to learn with explicit phonics instruction, and we need to ensure that we're providing that for all of our students. And then number 7, which I think that everybody would agree with, this sort of brings us full circle to what we talked about at the beginning, which is I think everybody comes into the world of education partly to give kids just the joy of learning and the joy of reading. But this science-based reading instruction is really urgent, and it's really the most crucial work of elementary teachers across the country. So we talk about this as the simple view of reading, but we understand that simple doesn't mean easy, and there is a difference. What we do know, though, is that if we focus on doing this kind of work every single day, in every single classroom, in every single school, and in every single district, we will see those numbers, like the NAEP reading scores, change. And so what can you do then to sort of extend your learning in terms of what it means for the science of reading? So the first thing you can do is join our Facebook group. This was launched yesterday. It's called The Science of Reading the Community. And make sure you do the colon and search for the community. But this is really our way of saying we want to learn from what's happening in the field, and we want to provide you with information about what it means to teach in the science of reading. So join that Facebook group. I think we launched yesterday, and we're up close to 250 already. So, so please log on and join there. The second thing, the Science of Reading, the podcast, coming in October, we're really going to bring you some insights from researchers and practitioners in early reading, because we really believe that this equity begins with the science of reading. Our goal in this podcast is not to talk to you or tell you about the products that we sell, but to really open up that conversation with guests such as Natalie Wexler and Robert Ponducci, Tim Rosinski. Tim Shanahan is slated for our podcast. So watch for that to be launched in the Facebook group, but we're really excited about just bringing these voices from the science of reading right to you through a podcast series. And then Science of Reading, the toolkit. We will follow up an email with you when you get the link to this recording along with this toolkit. I think we'll probably put it out there in our Facebook page as well. But this toolkit will give you some insights that you can start exploring deeper. For those of you that are building administrators or district leaders, it will give you some great resources for PLCs, any kind of, book group studies, working sessions you have, just to start the conversation. And by the way, as you're learning new things based on these insights, please post some of your learnings in that Facebook page so we can follow along with what you're doing. visit us at ILA. We will be at ILA. I think that's coming up in just a couple weeks. Stop by booth number 233. You can see our sessions that we're going to have there about some issues in education today, including more information on the science of reading. What does it mean to have literacy-rich science, and talking a little bit about dyslexia trends. We will also have some free swag for you there, so please stop by our booth and say hi. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we're going to take some questions and see what's going on out there with you. So the first question we have is, do all students need explicit decoding instruction, or only struggling students? I love this question. You know, I get this question in various forms. Sometimes people say to me, well, what do I do with my kindergarten students who already come to school knowing how to read? And I'm going to venture to say that probably those kids that come to school knowing how to read actually don't know all the 44 sound spelling patterns in the English language. They may be really good memorizers. They may have had parents that have read to them and they picked up some clues to the code, but they don't actually have all of it. So here's what we know from research. It hurts no child to have explicit decoding instruction. Those that don't have it and need it, it's detrimental to their schooling career. So what we need to understand is how quickly the students are learning the code, meaning that you'll probably have a group of students that once you explicitly introduce a piece of code, they catch on to it very quickly. You can launch them into extra practice and launch them into then extension activities. But make sure that all students get it so they don't hit that glass ceiling. Remember that 4th grade NAEP results, right? Is we have to understand that students need this decoding to be fluent readers so that they can put that decoding in their back pocket and focus their cognitive energy then on comprehension. And if students are struggling, which is the next question, what do you focus on? Do you focus on decoding? Do you focus on comprehension? What should you actually think about? And I think just understanding this formula for decoding and comprehension gives you the ability to sort of dig in and find out what they need. You'll have to do some analysis in this to understand, oof, is it that they can't decode or lift sort of the words off of the page? Or is it that they just don't have the language background or the language comprehension? And so there's ways that you can assess that to determine it, but I think the approach should be first, with a struggling student, do they need decoding? Do they need practice in language comprehension? And if you can assess that, then you can understand where you should target that instruction. So that's just a really good question as it relates to implementation. So another question, should we do reading aloud to the students either by the teacher or the students themselves? I love the question of read aloud. Let's talk a little bit about the research of listening comprehension versus reading comprehension. This links back to the idea of language comprehension. Remember, if kids don't have language comprehension, and this is auditory, right? Like this is not in the world of print. This is just in conversations and what kids are hearing and what kids are saying and what kind of things they know. We need to get this to kids early. And what we know is that a kid's language comprehension or listening comprehension will far outpace their reading comprehension until they're about 13 years old. Now, even when I did my undergraduate work in school for education, I remember them saying, yes, you know, keep reading aloud to kids until they're through middle school, but nobody ever told me why. Well, here's the why. The why is that when you read to a kid in kindergarten, you can read to them well above grade level. You can read to them about dinosaurs, ancient Greece, China, Africa, like all of these different topics. And they can actually understand, comprehend, and gain new knowledge from that in a way that they couldn't do if they were attempting to interact with the printed word. And so the best way to bridge that sort of knowledge gap is to do that in a read aloud environment and make that a regular part of what you're doing in your classroom. So that's a really great question. Another question is about curriculum. Curriculum is set at the local level. How do we help at the state level or the legislative level? Another great question. One thing that, I'm going to take it all the way down to sort of the classroom level. One of the things that's the hardest to control is a teacher can make a difference in the classroom, absolutely. But bringing this kind of structure to an individual classroom by an individual teacher in an individual year is actually going to not make much impact. The bigger impact would be if we could do that at the school level and ensure that we're meeting all the needs of the students within the school, and then at a district level. I think when we start to talk about the state level or the legislative level, we should be talking all about what do the reading proficiency scores look like and what are the things that we should focus on. I'm going to make a recommendation for a book that you can read by Natalie Wexler called The Knowledge Gap. This book brilliantly outlines the various places of impact that you can start highlighting within communities to start solving this problem. So that's a really great question. We're going to take just two more here. Another great question, what does it mean to lift the words off of the page? And how is that different from understanding the meaning of words? Thank you very much for asking that question, because this idea of lifting the words off the page, I refer to that when we're talking about decoding a word. So lifting the word off of the page itself is being able to recognize what that word says. So remember that passage that we were looking at, and I said you probably can decode or understand all of those words, but you could actually decode a word and never understand its meaning. So pretty quickly, I could sit down with you and I could actually teach you how to decode some words in a foreign language, maybe Spanish, right? I could teach you what sounds the letters made. We could put those words together and you could actually read, and see me do that in air quotes, you could read those words or you could say those words back to me. But that's devoid of meaning. And so in order to actually contextualize, gain meaning from a text, you have to understand what those words mean, not just individually, but what those words mean in the context of a sentence, and then what those sentences mean in the context of the paragraph. And that's all about your ability in the language comprehension environment. So thanks for that question. All right, let's take one more. I'm looking at this one, and here's a good question. How can we help students move from what they learn from short-term memory to long-term memory? I sort of made reference to multisensory instruction. This idea that instruction needs to be made engaging, it needs to be made relevant, and as it relates to decoding anyway, that's one of the best ways that you can do that. We know our brain needs multiple modes of stimulation, so in the decoding environment, we want to make sure that students are using their sounds and their words and their actions, and we're incorporating those into our decoding instruction. On the language comprehension side, it's really important that we're getting kids engaged and engrossed in topics that are deep and over time. So if we're going to talk about, let's say, animal classification, we don't want to read just a short article or spend just a small amount of time with kids on that, but what we want to do is we want to make sure we embed them in that instruction for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, or a longer amount of time, if you will. So they're listening to, they're talking about, and they're playing with the concepts, ideas, and words over and over and over again. Really good questions today. I really appreciate it. We're going to link you to the Facebook page in the chat box. We'd love to continue the conversation there, so please join us on the Facebook page. Please watch for those podcasts to come. And the other thing we want you to know that this is just the first in a series of webinars really digging deep into the science of reading. So watch that Facebook page as well for more webinars that will actually talk about what does it mean to have language comprehension and knowledge. So we're really excited that Natalie Wexler is going to join us for that webinar. After the first of the year, we're going to dig into the science of the decoding side, or the word recognition side. And we have a learning scientist here at Amplify that's actually going to lead that discussion. So watch for more to happen. Suggestions for topics, ideas, things you want to learn more about, things you are learning more about. Again, join us in that Facebook page so that we can extend this conversation and learn together. So thank you very much for joining. Appreciate your time and for your patience and willingness to start on the journey with us, and just have a great rest of your day.